You thought you knew your mind. But tonight, the walls crack. These 25 theories one set just explain consciousness. They pull it apart. The self will blur. The truth will bend. This is the present path. Don't resist the unraveling. What kept slipping away was never solid. Let it break. In the 1960s, a series of groundbreaking surgeries gave the world an unexpected window into consciousness, and it came through the blade of a scalpel. Neurosurgeons, attempting to relieve severe epileptic seizures, began severing the corpus callosum, the thick band of neural fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. The result was both medically effective and psychologically astonishing. These patients, known as split-brain patients, could walk, talk, and function in society, but under careful tests, something fractured began to show. Something no one expected. It appeared that two separate minds might now exist in one single skull. To understand what happened, you need to know how the brain's hemispheres normally operate. The left hemisphere typically governs language, logic, and analytical thinking. The right hemisphere leans towards spatial awareness, intuition, and emotion. In a healthy brain, the two halves are in constant communication, so integrated, you never notice the division. But once that bridge is cut, something strange emerges. In one famous experiment by Michael Gazzaniga, researchers flashed the word key to the left visual field, which routes to the right brain, and the word ring to the right visual field, which goes to the left brain. The patient was then asked what they saw. They said, ring. But when asked to pick up the object they saw with their left hand, they chose a key. Why? Because the left hemisphere, which controls speech, never saw the word key, only the right hemisphere saw it, and while it couldn't speak, it could control the left hand. Two parts of the same person, witnessing different things, reporting different realities, and yet, they weren't aware of the split. That's the true mystery. It wasn't that patients felt divided, they didn't feel multiple selves, they felt normal, unified. But their actions told another story, a story of two consciousnesses working in parallel, sometimes in conflict, but held together by habit and illusion. In another test, a patient's right hemisphere was shown a snow scene, and their left hemisphere was shown a chicken claw. When asked to pick two pictures that matched, they chose a shovel with the left hand to dig snow and a chicken with the right matching the claw. When asked why they picked a shovel, the speaking hemisphere, unaware of the snow scene, confidently said, "Oh, that's because you need a shovel to clean out the chicken coop." The brain didn't say, "I don't know." It invented a story. This phenomenon is called confabulation, when the conscious mind makes up a reason for something it didn't actually decide. And here sets the haunting part. You do this too. Every day. You don't notice it because your corpus callosum is intact. Your mind feels unified. But under the surface, there may be multiple systems acting independently, then post-rationalized by a narrator who thinks it's in charge. It sets as if your consciousness isn't a pilot, but a press secretary, explaining choices it never made. Some researchers now wonder, was the split brain surgery revealing something new? Or was it merely exposing something that was always true, that the self is a patchwork of processes, stitched together by memory, language, and the illusion of unity? There's no single you behind your eyes, just two hemispheres, talking in darkness, until one of them decides what story to tell. Even now, as you listen to these words, you may think it's a single voice inside your head interpreting them. But what if that voice is only half the story? And what if something else, quieter, wordless, maybe even disagreeing, is hearing them too? Maybe tonight, in the silence between thoughts, you feel it. Not a breakdown, not a fracture, but a curtain drawing back. On the crowded stage you call me. If you've ever found yourself staring out a window thinking of nothing in particular, and yet somehow thinking of everything, you've likely entered the realm of the default mode network, or DMN. It's the part of your brain that becomes most active when you're doing nothing. Not solving a task. Not focused on a screen. Not speaking, not moving. Just drifting, daydreaming, mind-wandering. And for a long time scientists thought this state was wasted energy, idle background noise, but that assumption collapsed with the rise of modern neuroscience. When researchers began conducting fMRI brain scans during resting states, when subjects weren't doing anything at all, they noticed something peculiar. Certain areas of the brain lit up more during rest than during conscious effort. This resting state wasn't set empty. It was alive. It had a structure, a rhythm, a presence. And so, the default mode network was born. The DMN primarily includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus, regions responsible for memory retrieval, self-reflection, and imagining alternative futures. In short, this is the brain's autobiographical narrator. It tells the story of you. When you recall an old friend, plan your weekend, imagine an argument, regret a choice, or rewrite a memory, that's the DMN in action. It creates mental simulations, weaving your past and future into a coherent sense of identity. But here's where the paradox begins. While the DMN helps define who you are, it may also be the very thing getting in your way. Researchers have found that overactivation of the DMN is linked with anxiety, depression, rumination, and even certain forms of psychosis. When the network loops too tightly, the mind becomes trapped in repetitive narratives, stories about the self that no longer serve but refuse to dissolve. In these moments, the DMN isn't set just narrating. It sits interrogating. It becomes the voice in your head asking why you're not enough, why you failed, why you never change. The brain, left to its own devices, starts talking to itself, and sometimes it doesn't say kind things. And yet, this same system is the bedrock of creativity. The DMN allows you to imagine what doesn't yet exist, to visualize music before its scene's composed, to simulate conversations, build moral dilemmas, rehearse apologies. It is the sandbox of consciousness, where identity is both drawn and redrawn. One of the most profound insights into the DMN came through the use of psychedelic substances like psilocybin and LSD. When volunteers were scanned under the influence of these drugs, researchers noticed something astonishing. The DMN shut down. Instead of fragmented loops of self-talk, the brain entered a hyper-connected state, where areas that normally never communicated began lighting up in symphony. The result? A loss of ego, a collapse of the inner monologue, and often a feeling of unity with everything. This is why many describe psychedelic experiences as more real than real. Not because the world changes, but because the default world of the self dissolves. Meditation produces a similar effect. Long-term meditators show reduced DMN activity and increased present-centered awareness. Instead of replaying the self's movie again and again, the mind becomes quiet, able to witness rather than react. So what is the DMN really? A brain network? A glitch? A helpful narrator? Or a tyrant in disguise? It might be all of those. It SEPs the echo chamber of selfhood, the recursive engine that tells you what kind of person you are. Sometimes truthfully, often falsely, but always with conviction. And here SEPs the twist. The more you listen, the more you believe the voice is you. But it isn't stat. You stir the awareness that hears the voice, not the voice itself. Tonight, as your mind begins to drift, you may notice it spinning again. Memories, futures, identities. But just for a moment, see if you can watch it instead of becoming it. Let the default mode network speak if it must. But remember, you stir the silence it speaks into. But what's often missed in this division is that you are never just one or the other. Most people know the brain has two hemispheres, left and right, and that each has its specialties. The left is logical, linguistic, analytical. The right is intuitive, visual, holistic. Consciousness may emerge not from dominance but from balance, from a fragile dance between two distinct processors trying to agree on a single experience. This idea has deep roots in neuroscience, but its full implications weren't explored until more recent research revealed how these hemispheres communicate not just by sharing data, but by aligning in synchrony, that is, through rhythmic harmonic waves of neural activity. The corpus callosum, that thick bridge of nerve fibers, plays the role of the conductor. If the hemispheres fall out of sync, due to trauma, overthinking, exhaustion, or mental illness, the brain begins to fragment, and the sense of cohesive consciousness may dissolve. When the brain is working efficiently, During moments of focus, insight, or meditation, it exhibits coherent oscillations across regions, especially between the hemispheres. These synchronized brain waves often appear in theta 4-8 Hz and alpha 8-12 Hz ranges, which are associated with flow states, deep relaxation, and even mystical experiences. Think of it like a symphony. If each half of the orchestra plays a different song, what you get is noise. But when they align even briefly, the experience feels transcendent. This brings us to a set of strange experiments from the late 20th century, often used in neurofeedback therapy. Subjects would be hooked up to EEG monitors measuring hemispheric activity, then given audio cues to help them bring both sides of the brain into rhythmic alignment, a practice called binaural entrainment. A sense of watching themselves from outside. In many cases, subjects reported unusual shifts in awareness, feeling time expand or slow, emotional clarity without mental chatter, visualizing symbolic patterns or forgotten memories. These weren't set hallucinations. They were resynchronizations, the hemispheres getting back in tune. Some went further. A few pioneering studies tried combining hemispheric training with lucid dreaming, hypnagogic states, or controlled breathing techniques. The results were often the same: increased clarity, reduced anxiety, and a sudden sense that the eye had stopped being at war with itself. This phenomenon links with what mystics across cultures have long described: the Vedantic union of Shiva and Shakti, the Taoist balance of yin and yang, the Gnostic merging of masculine and feminine elements of the soul. And while these ancient traditions use different language, the core idea echoes the same: the self is divided, and only through harmony does awakening begin. Psychologist Ian McGilchrist, in his monumental work The Master and His Emissary, argued that the left hemisphere has become dominant in modern life, privileging control, categorization, and abstraction, while the right hemisphere, which embraces uncertainty, metaphor, and connection, has been silenced. When the hemispheres fall out of harmony, you don't just lose balance. As a result, modern consciousness may be tilted, imbalanced, chronically out of sync, not because the brain is broken, but because it's overtrained in one mode of being. This imbalance doesn't just affect thoughts, it shapes identity. You start to believe that you are the imbalance. Ideas without intuition. You become words without emotion. But hemispheric synchrony suggests something gentler, and eventually, a story that no longer fits the experience of being alive. Control without context. Something whole. That consciousness is not something you find, but something you tune, where the chatter slows, and that the feeling of being yourself may arise only when your inner opposites stop fighting and start listening. Tonight, as you settle into this exploration, you might notice moments where everything feels just a little more clear, where the left stops judging and the right stops hiding. That SEP's not magic. Where you feel aligned. That SIP's rhythm. That SEP's you, in tune with yourself. You were never meant to be one side or the other. You were meant to be the harmony between them. Right now, as you hear these words, your brain is processing sounds, shapes, memories, attention, and emotional tone, all at once. Yet what you experience feels like a single unified moment, a seamless self. A now. But here sips the question that sips haunted neuroscientists for decades. How? This is known as the binding problem, the mystery of how the brain integrates separate processes into a unified field of consciousness. Let's break it down. Your visual cortex processes shape and color. Your auditory cortex processes sound. Your somatosensory cortex processes touch and body position. All of these areas operate in parallel, in different regions of the brain, with different processing times. And yet, you experience them together. When you see a red ball bounce and hear the thump, you don't process those as separate phenomena, even though one traveled as light, the other as vibration. You perceive a single event. One ball, one bounce, one self, witnessing it. So what sets stitching all of this together? That SEP's the paradox. No one knows. We can track the signals. We can map the circuits. But we cannot yet explain why there is a subjective unity at the end of it. The philosopher David Chalmers famously coined this the hard problem of consciousness, not how the brain works, but how and why it feels like anything at all. There are many theories. Some suggest that neural synchrony, when multiple areas of the brain fire in rhythm, is what binds experience. Others propose global workspace theory, where various signals compete for attention and the winner becomes conscious. Still others propose that consciousness is non-local, emerging from quantum coherence, electromagnetic fields, or structures we don't yet understand. But all of them face the same wall. How does electricity become awareness? Imagine a room full of TV screens, each showing a different input, one for sound, one for color, one for language, one for emotion. You could walk between them and understand the components. But who's watching all of them at once? Your brain is like that room, and somehow the chaos collapses into a stream. This stream doesn't just carry sensations. It carries you, your personality, your opinions, your sense of continuity, the feeling that the same I who woke up this morning is the one hearing this now. But there sits no central screen inside your brain. No projector. No tiny homunculus sitting in a control room. And yet, it feels like there is. This illusion of unity is so powerful it becomes the foundation of identity, but experiments suggest it's not as solid as it seems. Take change blindness. In one study, participants watched a video where two people swapped places behind a visual obstruction. Many subjects failed to notice, even when the people were of different genders or races. The brain simply filled in the blanks. What mattered was the story, not the reality. This is binding in action. Not just binding sensory inputs, but binding beliefs, keeping you inside a consistent narrative. It's also why trauma can feel so confusing, because it shatters binding. Suddenly your emotions don't match your memories. Your sense of self becomes unstable. The narrative breaks. And in reverse, during flow states, spiritual experiences or deep meditation, people often report the opposite, an even deeper sense of unity than usual. Like all parts of the self are in alignment. Or that there is no self at all, only witnessing. That too is binding. But without the ego. So perhaps the question isn't just how consciousness is unified, but why it needs to be. What if the self isn't a being, but a binding strategy? A trick the brain plays to keep the system running smoothly. To avoid overload. To give a single name to 1,000 processes. You. Tonight, as your awareness begins to soften, you may notice the parts drifting, sound over here, sensation over there, thought in a corner. You don't need to hold them together. You never really did. Just notice the unity was always temporary. Always stitched together in the moment. And always dissolving again when you're quiet enough to feel it. There sets a moment in early childhood, usually around 18 months of age, when something quiet but monumental happens. A child looks in the mirror and recognizes themselves. Not as a moving image. Not as another person. But as me. This moment marks the beginning of what psychologists call self-recognition, the earliest flicker of conscious identity. And it's captured by a simple but profound experiment known as the mirror test, first developed by psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. in 1970. The test is straightforward. A colored mark like a red dot is placed on an animal's face while it's asleep or distracted. Then it's placed in front of a mirror. If the animal notices the mark on its own face and tries to touch or investigate it, it passes. Why does this matter? Because it suggests the animal possesses something deeper than awareness. It suggests meta-awareness, the ability to reflect not just on the world but on the self as an object in the world. That red dot becomes a portal. Do you know that you are a being, and not just a body? Humans typically pass the test around age 1.5 to 2, but very few other species do. Among those who pass, great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, dolphins, elephants, magpies, some ants, bizarrely under specific conditions. These creatures, in some form, demonstrate a capacity for self-recognition. They don't just see a reflection, they interpret it. But here sits where things get strange. Some humans, particularly those with certain neurological conditions, may fail the mirror test, even though they can speak, think, and live functional lives. Some forms of autism, dementia, or face blindness, prosopagnosia, interfere with the recognition of self-images. And yet those same individuals can describe their feelings, their beliefs, their memories. So what is the mirror test really testing? Perhaps not consciousness, but visual identity. Perhaps not do you exist, but do you think you look like this? And what happens when someone passes the test, but later loses that recognition? Patients with Codard's delusion, a rare neurological disorder, may look into a mirror and insist they are dead, or no longer exist. They see the face. They acknowledge the body. But something inside has broken the link between image and identity. The mirror no longer reflects the self. It reflects absence. There are also cultural complications. In some traditional societies, mirrors are rarely used, and children may not pass the test even at older ages, not due to a lack of consciousness, but due to unfamiliarity with reflection as a concept. Their sense of self isn't set absent. It's set's just not visual. So again we ask, what is the real test? Maybe it's this. Can you see yourself from the outside? Not just your face, but your choices. Your beliefs. Your behaviors. Your contradictions. Can you notice when you stare being defensive? Can you admit when you have changed? Can you hold your own identity at arm's length and say, this is what I've become, but it may not be what I will be? That seps the mirror behind the mirror. And many never look into it. Psychologist Daniel Dennett argued that consciousness isn't a thing, but a set of recursive loops. You know something, then you know that you know it. Then you wonder how you know. And on it goes. Selfhood in this model isn't it a fixed entity? It's a hall of mirrors, endlessly reflecting reflections of reflections. So when you look in a mirror, what do you really see? Just your face? Or the flicker of a process, millions of neurons simulating a body wrapped in memory, soaked in culture, stabilized by stories? And does that process recognize itself? Tonight, as the room dims and your thoughts begin to slow, consider that the mirror isn't set just glass. It sebs every moment of self-reflection. Every time you ask, why did I do that? Every time you wonder, is this still me? You pass the mirror test, not by seeing the dot on your forehead, but by noticing the shadow behind your actions. You are the observer, observing the one who observes. You reach for a glass of water. You blink. You decide to listen to this video. Simple actions, clear intentions. You feel like you chose them. But what if you didn't set? What if your decisions were already made, and consciousness was just the story you tell yourself after the fact? That's the unsettling implication behind one of the most famous and controversial neuroscience experiments ever conducted, the Libet experiment. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet placed electrodes on subjects' scalps and asked them to perform a simple task: flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, and simultaneously note the precise moment they felt the intention to move. What he found shocked the scientific world. Electrical activity in the brain, specifically in the motor cortex, began roughly 300 milliseconds before the subject reported deciding to move. In other words, the brain moved before the self chose. Your body was already preparing the action, before you were even aware of wanting it. And that raised a profound question. If your brain decides before you do, then who, or what, is the real decision maker? Libet himself tried to soften the blow. He suggested that while we might not initiate actions, we could still exert a veto power, the ability to stop a preconscious impulse from becoming behavior. He called it free won't instead of free will, but many others saw it differently. To them, the experiment hinted at a terrifying possibility, that free will is an illusion, and consciousness is more like a news anchor, reporting events it had no part in creating. This view has only deepened with time. More modern versions of the experiment, using fMRI and EEG scans, have shown that predictive signals in the brain can sometimes appear up to 7 seconds before the subject reports making a decision. 7 seconds. That's an eternity in neuroscience. It means your brain has often already chosen, long before you become aware of choosing. Of course, critics argue that these tasks are too simple. Flicking a wrist isn't the same as deciding who to marry or what job to take. But even in more complex decisions, studies show that emotional and unconscious factors play a massive role, often guiding your actions before any rational explanation is formed. Think about the last big choice you made. How much of it was really yours? And how much was shaped by childhood, hormones, sleep, hunger, social conditioning, trauma, or the way a question was framed. Now imagine that same network making decisions before you're even aware a decision is necessary. Here is SIPS where it gets personal. If you aren't set choosing, then what are you? Are you just a witness? A passenger in a vehicle already in motion? And if so, why does it feel like you're in control? That's SEP's the deeper illusion. Not just of choice, but of authorship. The mind creates a smooth, continuous narrative, stitching decisions into a coherent identity. It tells you, you wanted this, you made the call, you are the source. But maybe you're just the narrator. Maybe the decisions come first, and the explanation comes later. And maybe that SEP's okay, because there sits another way to see this. Not as a loss of freedom, but as a liberation from blame. If everything arises from conditions, biology, context, history, emotion, then maybe judgment softens. Maybe compassion grows. Maybe you realize that everyone is acting from causes they didn't choose, even when they believe they did. The idea that you are not your choices, but the space in which choices arise, can be terrifying, but it can also be peaceful. It means you don't have to fight yourself so much. You don't have to be better out of guilt. You can begin to observe yourself the way you observe the sky, with curiosity, not control. Tonight, as you lie here listening, watch your thoughts move. Watch your impulses rise. Notice how they appear, how they shift, how they fade, all without your permission. And ask yourself, if I didn't summon this thought, and I can stop the next one from coming, then who exactly is doing this life? Maybe there sits no one doing. Maybe there's SEP's only being. And maybe that SEP's not a failure of control, but the beginning of understanding. For most of human history, we believed the brain was fixed. That by adulthood, your neural circuits were fully wired. Your personality mostly formed. Your habits more or less permanent. Damage to the brain, irreversible. Mental traits, innate. The self, set like concrete. But then, something remarkable began to emerge. Stories. Exceptions. Miracles. A blind man learning to see with his tongue. A stroke patient regaining speech by drawing with the left hand. A child with half a brain developing almost normal intelligence. And beneath these stories was one revolutionary truth. The brain can rewire itself. This is the heart of neuroplasticity. The discovery that your brain is not static but dynamic. It sets always adapting, always sculpting itself in response to what you do, what you feel, and what you believe. At the cellular level, this means that neurons, brain cells, form new connections, strengthen old ones, or let unused ones fade. The phrase often used is, neurons that fire together, wire together. Every habit, every skill, every repeated emotion leaves a mark. And over time those marks become you. This isn't set, just poetic metaphor. It sets visible in scans. Studies show that London taxi drivers, who memorize the city's complex road network, develop a larger hippocampus, the brain region responsible for spatial memory. Musicians show enhanced activity in areas linked to fine motor control. Meditators develop thicker gray matter in regions tied to attention and emotional regulation. But the implications go further. People who ruminate, who dwell on negativity, literally strengthen the neural circuits of anxiety. People who practice gratitude rewire their brains toward optimism. Addiction changes the brain SEP's reward pathways. So does love. So does trauma. And all of this means, you are not a fixed self. You are a shifting pattern, a living network of tendencies that can be nudged, trained, reshaped, for better or worse. One of the most hopeful examples comes from stroke rehabilitation. Traditionally, patients were told to accept their limitations, that once neurons died, the functions were lost. But newer therapies push the opposite. A paralyzed limb. Use constraint-induced movement therapy where the healthy limb is restrained, forcing the brain to find new ways to use the damaged one. And it works. Patients often recover significant mobility, not by healing the dead tissue but by rerouting function through alternate circuits. It's SEP's not magic. It's SEP's plasticity. But neuroplasticity also comes with a warning. Because just as the brain can wire itself toward growth, it can also wire itself toward limitation. Every time you avoid a challenge, reinforce a fear, sink into the comfort of passive distraction, you strengthen those patterns too. Plasticity doesn't care about right or wrong. It only cares about repetition. Which means, you are, in some very real sense, what you practice. And this leads to a deeper philosophical shift. The self is not a static object, but a process in motion, not found in the brain, but made by the brain, moment by moment, through action, intention, and attention. Even memory isn't step fixed. Every time you recall an event, your brain reconstructs it, often slightly differently, and that reconstructed version becomes the new memory. So your past is not a library of facts. It's a story being rewritten every time it's told. And your future, that too is shaped by how you choose to use your mind today. Neuroplasticity suggests that the boundary between will and structure is blurrier than we thought. You may not choose every thought, but how you relate to those thoughts, over and over, creates the self you become. So what does that mean for you now? It means your mind is soft clay. It means your identity is not trapped. It means even tonight, as you lie here listening, your brain is changing. Just by noticing. Just by caring. Just by imagining the possibility of change. No grand transformation is needed. Just gentle repetition. Again. And again. And again. Until the new self becomes the familiar one. Until you forget who you were trying to become. And simply are. Why does it feel like anything to be you? Not how does your brain process light, or sound, or language. Science can explain that in layers of neural computation. But why do those processes result in an inner world? A flicker of color behind your eyelids. A memory that hurts. A feeling of me. This is what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains one of the most unresolved puzzles in all of science and philosophy. Here stees the issue in simple terms. Your brain is made of atoms, neurons, electricity, chemistry, just like a computer is made of silicon and switches. But when a computer runs, we see outputs, behavior, speech, decisions, but not subjective experience. A computer can say, I set him in pain, but there is no one inside to actually feel it. You, on the other hand, iron set just running processes. You stir having them. You stir not just registering color. You stir seeing blue. You stir not just reacting to loss. You stir feeling sadness. This gap between mechanism and experience is what the hard problem names. Why does information processing in the brain give rise to the qualia of experience, the raw sensations of being? Chalmers separates this from the easy problems, which are still difficult but solvable in theory. These include how the brain categorizes stimuli, how attention is directed, how behavior is generated. All of these can in principle be explained in terms of neurons and computation. But none of them explain why there's anybody home. You could build a robot that passes every behavioral test, that says I love you, that reports pain, that mimics emotions, and still not know if it's conscious or just convincingly programmed. This is called the philosophical zombie, a being that acts exactly like a person but has no internal experience. And it leads to the haunting question, how do we know we are not just zombies ourselves? Or more radically, how do we know anyone else is conscious? There is no objective test for subjectivity. You only know you are conscious because you are. The rest is assumption. So, what are the theories? Some propose that consciousness is an emergent property, a side effect of complexity, that once you get enough neurons connected in the right way, experience spontaneously appears. Others argue that consciousness is fundamental, not something the brain creates, but something the brain taps into, like a radio tuning into a universal field. This leads to Panpsychism, the idea that consciousness exists everywhere, even in particles, and complex forms of it just arise in brains. Then there's integrated information theory, IIT, which suggests consciousness corresponds to the amount of information a system can integrate, meaning some systems, even artificial ones, could eventually become conscious if they reach a certain threshold. But all these theories hit the same wall. They can describe patterns but not presence. They can explain what the brain does, not what it feels like to be the brain. And that seps the core of the hard problem. We don't just want to explain behavior. We want to explain being. This matters deeply. Because if consciousness is just an illusion, a side effect of computation, then morality, love, meaning, are just chemical noise. But if consciousness is real and irreducible, then even a fleeting moment of awareness matters more than the entire physical universe. Because it's through consciousness that the universe is known at all. The hard problem doesn't ask for answers. It asks you to feel the weight of the question. To sit in that strange gap between brain and mind, between flesh and feeling. Tonight, as your breath slows and your awareness drifts, you may begin to notice the simplest truth of all, that you are here. Not just functioning, not just analyzing, but experiencing. And no one knows why, but that doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it sacred. You are the mystery, looking at itself. Through borrowed eyes. Close your eyes for a moment. Now ask yourself, how do you know anything around you is real? The chair beneath you, the voice in your ears, the memory of your own face. It all seems solid, undeniable. But here steps the unsettling truth. Every experience you've ever had, sight, sound, touch, taste, memory, has been mediated by your brain. You don't experience the world directly. You experience signals. Your eyes translate light into neural data. Your ears do the same with vibrations. Your skin with pressure. Your tongue with chemistry. It's all just patterns of input interpreted by an organ inside a dark, sealed skull. This leads to one of the most famous philosophical thought experiments of the 20th century, a modern twist on Descartes' radical doubt. It's called the brain in a vat. Imagine this. You are just a brain, floating in a nutrient-rich vat, hooked up to an advanced supercomputer. That computer feeds you perfect electrical signals, simulating a life, just as real as the one you think you're living now. Could you tell the difference? If the signals were identical to those your brain would normally receive from a real body in a real world, there would be no way to know. The experience would feel the same. The illusion would be complete. You'd think you had hands. You'd think you had memories. You'd believe in your identity, your family, your city, your dreams. All fabricated. All electrical patterns. And that seps the terrifying implication. If consciousness is brain-based, and brains can be deceived by data, then everything you believe could be a simulation. This isn't just science fiction. It's used in philosophical discussions to challenge our assumptions about knowledge, evidence, and certainty. Because if you can prove you not a brain in a vat, then how can you prove anything? Even neuroscience itself becomes questionable. The data from the world could all be part of the simulation. The scientists, the lab, the instruments, part of the illusion. This idea has evolved into modern versions, like Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis, which suggests that a technologically advanced civilization could run ancestor simulations, and if so, there may be billions of simulated minds for every one real one. Statistically, it might even be more likely that you are in a simulation than in base reality. So why does this matter? Because it reveals a profound fragility at the heart of our belief system. We assume that experience equals truth. That reality is what we see. But that assumption is built on trust, not proof. Trust in your senses. Trust in memory. Trust that there's a real body behind your thoughts. But if that trust is misplaced, then who are you? A character? A computation? An experiment? Or maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the experience is the reality, even if it's virtual. If your love feels real, if your pain shapes you, if your curiosity leads you somewhere new, then maybe that's enough. And even if you're just a brain in a vat, wondering if you're a brain in a vat, isn't that still a kind of consciousness? Isn't the question itself evidence of something deeper? Here's the final twist. This theory doesn't just cast doubt on the world. It casts doubt on the self. If your identity is just a program, a narrative being fed into the system, then the you are defending, improving, remembering, might not exist in the way you thought. And that step's either deeply terrifying or strangely liberating. Because if self and world are both uncertain, then the only truth that remains is awareness itself. The awareness that something is happening. Even if you can prove what it is. Even if you don't know who is watching. Tonight, as you drift between thoughts, let go of trying to verify the world. Let go of the need to be certain. Just stay with the one thing you can doubt. That something is aware. And that something feels like you. You are certain it happened. You remember the room. You remember who was there. You remember what was said, maybe even the way it made you feel. And yet it didn't set. This is the unsettling territory of false memories, one of the most well-documented and most disturbing findings in the science of consciousness. We like to think of memory as a kind of internal recording device. A camera that captures life and plays it back, sometimes a little blurry but mostly intact. But memory doesn't work like that. In fact, memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. Every time you remember something, your brain rebuilds it from fragments, sensory impressions, emotional traces, and storytelling habits. And like any story retold too often, the details shift. You don't remember the original event. You remember the last time you remembered it. This was demonstrated in a series of pioneering studies by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. In one experiment, she showed participants a video of a car crash, and then asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Others were asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? The word choice mattered. Those who heard smashed estimated much higher speeds, and later reported seeing broken glass that didn't exist. With just a single word, the memory was altered, and the participants didn't realize it. In another experiment, Loftus planted entire false childhood memories, including being lost in a shopping mall, by using suggestive prompts and confirmation from trusted sources. Many subjects not only believed these events had happened, they added new details, emotions, even smells. What does this mean? It means your brain isn't just remembering. It sets storytelling. And that story feels true, even when it isn't set. This has huge implications for how we understand consciousness. Because your identity, your sense of self, is built on memory. Your decisions, beliefs, relationships, even your regrets are shaped by what you think happened. But if memory is unstable, then so is the self. There are even cases of entire communities forming shared false memories, known as the Mandela effect. People remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison, in the 1980s, even though he didn't. They remember the Berenstain Bears, spelled Berenstein. They recall movie quotes, product logos, historical timelines, all differently from what actually occurred. Some speculate about parallel realities or timeline shifts. But psychology offers a simpler, and more haunting, explanation. Memory is suggestible, vulnerable to group pressure, shaped by emotion, edited by culture. Even eyewitness testimony, once considered the gold standard in courtrooms, is now known to be notoriously unreliable. And yet the memories feel so real. That's the paradox. False memories aren't vague. They serve vivid. They carry weight, meaning, emotional charge. You don't suspect them because they don't feel false. And here's where it gets deeply personal. What if some of your most cherished or painful memories never happened the way you think? What if your greatest wound is based on a misremembered moment? What if your most treasured certainty is a reconstructed tale? Would it change who you are? Or is the emotional truth of the memory what really matters? In a sense, all memory is partial fiction. But that fiction becomes the scaffold of the self. We are, as writer Joan Didion once said, the stories we tell ourselves in order to live. So where does that leave us? If your mind can fabricate the past, then what anchors you in the present? Maybe nothing. Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the answer isn't to distrust memory, but to hold it lightly, to see your memories not as facts, but as weather systems, changing, returning, vanishing, reappearing, not fixed, but alive. Tonight, as you drift into the folds of memory, as old scenes rise up, uninvited, see if you can simply watch them. Don't try to verify. Don't try to correct. Just notice what comes, and know that the self you feel is not a container of truth. It's a mirror of recollection. And that too is consciousness. Not because it remembers, but because it wonders what sits true. Imagine hearing music and seeing colors, or tasting a word, or feeling a number as a texture against your skin. For people with synesthesia, this isn't imagination. It's experience, involuntary, consistent, and as real to them as sight or sound is to you. Synesthesia, from the Greek for joined perception, is a neurological condition, or perhaps a trait, in which stimulation of one sensory pathway triggers automatic experiences in a second, unrelated sense. It sets not metaphor. It sets not hallucination. It sets perception fused. The most common form is grapheme color synesthesia, where letters and numbers are perceived as having specific colors. For example, the letter A might always appear red, B blue, C green, even if printed in black ink. Others experience chromesthesia, where sounds evoke colors or light patterns. For these individuals, a violin note might flare gold, a trumpet might shimmer blue. Still others have lexical gustatory synesthesia, in which words, even names, trigger specific tastes. Hearing calendar might produce the flavor of dry toast. The name Julian might taste like sweet onions. And while these associations might seem strange, they are incredibly stable over time. A synesthete who sees the number 5 as green today will likely see it as green a decade from now. What causes this? Neuroscientists believe that synesthesia results from increased crosstalk between brain regions that are usually more isolated. In particular, sensory areas in the temporal and parietal lobes may have excess connectivity, allowing information to leak from one modality into another. In normal brains, these boundaries are strict. You see light, you hear sound, you feel heat. But in synesthetic brains, the borders are blurred. And when one region fires, another follows, creating a composite experience. But here sits where things get strange. All of us are born with synesthetic wiring. In infancy, the brain is a riot of connections. Senses are not yet fully differentiated. Babies often exhibit behaviors that suggest multisensory fusion, like being startled by certain colors or staring transfixed at voices. Over time, the brain prunes its excess connections. But in synesthetes, some of those connections remain. This raises a provocative idea. Maybe synesthesia is not a mutation. Maybe it's a remnant, a glimpse of how consciousness once was, or how it could be. It's worth noting that synesthesia is not considered a disorder. In fact, many synesthetes consider it a gift, a secret dimension to reality. Some of the world's most creative minds were believed to be synesthetes. Composer Franz Liszt, who instructed orchestra members to play more blue, artist Wassily Kandinsky, who painted what he heard, author Vladimir Nabokov, who wrote of his colored letters and spatial days. Their inner worlds weren't imagined, they were sensed. So what does this say about consciousness? It suggests that the boundaries between senses, between modalities, between categories, are not as solid as we think. It suggests that perception is not passive but constructed, and can be constructed in radically different ways. If some people taste sounds and hear colors, then what we call normal perception is just one version of reality. A consensus, not a rule. And it points to something deeper. That even the most basic experiences like seeing a color may not be universal. What does red feel like to you? Is it the same red I see? Is it even a color, or an emotion, or an echo? There sits no way to know. All perception is private. Even shared experience is just parallel solitude. But synesthesia breaks that illusion. It reminds us that the senses are not separate worlds, but overlapping systems of meaning. It invites us to imagine a different kind of mind. Not better or worse, just stranger. And perhaps, more fluid, more poetic. Tonight, as the sounds of this audio fold into your mind, ask yourself, what does this voice feel like? What shape does this moment take? Can you sense the overlap? Maybe you don't see letters as colors. Maybe you don't taste names. But somewhere in your mind, something ancient still knows how. A cross-wired spark. A forgotten pathway. A whisper that maybe all of this is more connected than it seems. Close your eyes and picture yourself inside your own head. You may imagine a kind of inner pilot, a tiny you behind your eyes, steering your thoughts, directing your actions, making choices. It feels intuitive, comforting even. As if consciousness were a central command center, with a miniature version of yourself sitting inside, watching the world through your senses. This imagined little person is what philosophers and neuroscientists call the homunculus, Latin for little man. It's a metaphor we've all internalized, even if we don't realize it. But here's the catch. The homunculus is a logical fallacy. Because if there's a little self inside your head, then who sits inside its head? Another homunculus. And another. An infinite nesting doll of selves. It leads to an endless regress, a puzzle with no end. And more importantly, it distracts from a deeper question. If there still no one inside watching the mind, then what is consciousness? Neuroscience offers a very different picture. Rather than a central observer, the brain is a distributed system, a web of specialized modules processing information in parallel. Some monitor body position. Others track visual stimuli, language, emotion, intention. And they don't at all agree. There's no CEO at the top. No ghost in the machine. Just countless subsystems negotiating reality. Take the motor cortex, for example. It initiates movement not by deciding in the way we think, but by integrating signals from sensory input, prior learning, and predicted outcomes. Your hand doesn't move because a tiny you told it to. It moves because of a complex chain of signals, many of which never reach awareness. Even your sense of self is modular. The feeling of being you arises from brain regions like the insula, default mode network, and temporoparietal junction, areas responsible for integrating bodily sensation, social perspective, and narrative continuity. Damage one of these areas, and identity can fracture. There are people who feel like their body doesn't belong to them, others who believe they're dead, Cotard's delusion, or who believe a loved one has been replaced by an imposter, Capgras syndrome. These are not character flaws. They serve disruptions in the illusion of unity. And that's the key. The self is not a single thing. It's a construction, stitched together by the brain moment to moment. And that construction includes the illusion of a watcher. You're not being watched by a homunculus. You're experiencing the effect of countless systems creating the feeling of being watched. Even when you reflect, even when you talk to yourself, the speaker and the listener are parts of the same system. No little man required. So why do we feel like there's a self inside? Because that illusion is useful. It allows for planning, moral reasoning, social cohesion, and emotional regulation. It gives continuity to the stream of experience. It binds thought and body into a coherent narrative. But when we look too closely, it dissolves. This is why deep meditation often leads to what's called ego dissolution. The feeling that the observer has vanished. That there is no longer a boundary between you and experience. And many describe it not as terrifying but as freeing. Because the homunculus doesn't just watch. It judges. It fears. It takes credit and assigns blame. And when it falls silent, what remains is just awareness itself, unfiltered, unowned. In psychological terms, this shift can be healing. It reduces over-identification with thought. It reveals that moods, habits, even identities are not fixed. They're passing phenomena, not the observer itself. So tonight, as you relax deeper into this space, you might notice that voice in your head, the one narrating, analyzing, trying to make sense. And you might ask, who is it speaking to? Who is hearing these thoughts? And is that voice you? Or just another part of the system? Another echo inside the cave? There is no tiny self pulling the levers. There is only process. And presence. And the miracle is not that there's someone inside. The miracle is that anything appears at all. That there's awareness, listening to itself, in a vast, empty theater, with no actor, and no stage. At this very moment, your body is taking in millions of bits of information, the hum of the air around you, the pressure of the floor under your feet, the temperature on your skin, the light bouncing off every surface, the sounds in the distance, the faint memory that just passed by. And yet, You stir only aware of a tiny sliver, a thin trickle of data, delivered one thought at a time. Why? Because of what neuroscientists call the consciousness bottleneck, the idea that while your brain processes a vast flood of sensory input at all times, your conscious awareness can only attend to a very narrow stream. This limitation isn't set a flaw. It sets by design. Your brain is a survival machine, not a data recorder, and conscious awareness, as powerful as it feels, is more like a spotlight in a massive darkened theater. You only see what the light hits. Everything else is happening without you. Consider the classic study of inattentional blindness. In a now famous experiment, participants were asked to watch a video and count how many times a basketball was passed between players. Halfway through the video, a person in a full gorilla suit walks into frame, pauses, beats their chest, and walks off. When asked afterward, nearly half the viewers failed to notice the gorilla at all. They weren't set lying. They truly didn't set see it. Why? Because they weren't set attending to it. Their consciousness was fully absorbed by the task at hand, and anything outside that narrow beam vanished. This is the bottleneck in action. It's not just about visual input. It applies to sound, memory, emotion, even inner thought. At any given moment, countless cognitive processes are happening beneath awareness, filtering what you hear, regulating your heart rate, predicting the next word in a sentence, evaluating social cues, suppressing irrelevant memories, generating micro-decisions. You are not doing these things. They are being done. And consciousness is simply notified afterward, if at all. Some researchers estimate that your brain processes up to 11 million bits of information per second, but conscious awareness handles only about 50. That's SEPs, not even a trickle. That's SEPs a drop. And yet, that drop feels like everything. That's SEPs the paradox. You feel like you're fully present, fully informed, fully awake, but in truth, you're walking through a world of perceptual hallucination, a carefully constructed model built by unconscious systems, delivered in curated form. Even your sense of time is filtered. Your brain doesn't then experience milliseconds. It works in cycles, snapshots stitched together. Some studies suggest that what we perceive as now may be a delay, a small buffer that allows the brain to synchronize inputs and resolve contradictions. So even your present moment might be an illusion, a best guess constructed just after the fact. What does this mean for consciousness? It means that your experience of reality is not raw data, but a story written by unconscious editors, delivered to your awareness like headlines from a newswire. And the self? It's just another product of that bottleneck. You don't experience the whole of yourself. You experience what's relevant to the current moment, filtered through mood, attention, memory, and social context. And so, just like the gorilla, you often miss the most important things in your own life. A friend said silent withdrawal. Your body sets subtle fatigue. A thought that tried to warn you. A joy you didn't notice until it passed. But there's another way to see this. The bottleneck isn't just limitation. It's focus. It's what allows you to tune in to a single voice in a crowd. To become lost in a story. To feel meaning in a simple glance. Without it, life would be noise. But knowing the bottleneck exists invites humility. It reminds you that you don't see the whole picture. That there's more happening always than you can know. And that's not failure. That's mystery. Tonight, as you feel your awareness narrow, not out of effort but of fatigue, notice what it chooses to keep, what it lets through, and what it quietly sets aside. Don't fight it. Just watch. You are not the flood. You are the current. You are not the system. You are the thread that weaves through it. And the miracle isn't that you perceive everything. It's that you perceive anything at all. You think you see with your eyes. You think the world enters your mind, raw and real. But neuroscience now suggests something radically different. You don't see the world. You predict it. This is the heart of what's known as the predictive processing model of the brain, a growing theory that reframes consciousness not as passive reception, but as active inference. Your brain in this model is not a camera. It's a prediction machine. Every moment it generates an internal model of what it expects the world to be. Then it compares incoming sensory signals to that model. If the input matches the prediction, very little needs to be updated. But if there's a mismatch, a surprise, your brain adjusts the model. This is what neuroscientists call prediction error minimization. And in many ways, it defines how you move through reality. Let's break it down. When you walk into your kitchen, you don't see it from scratch. Your brain anticipates the shape of the counter, the color of the light, the location of the fridge. Your eyes merely confirm or correct the model. This is why when something's slightly off, like a glass moved an inch, you feel a strange jolt. It violated your prediction. And this goes far deeper than visual space. You predict the tone of someone's voice before they speak. You predict the taste of food before it touches your tongue. You predict emotional outcomes in conversations and often behave to fulfill them. In fact, some scientists believe that emotions themselves are predictions, your brain guessing what your body is about to feel based on past patterns. So what does this mean for consciousness? It means that much of your experience is constructed ahead of time. The mind doesn't wait for reality. It guesses it, and only updates when forced. This explains powerful illusions, like the hollow mask illusion, where a concave mask of a face appears to pop outward. Why? Because your brain is so convinced that faces should protrude, it overrides the raw data. It also explains why people with certain conditions, like schizophrenia or autism, may process the world differently. Their prediction systems may be tuned in unusual ways, either too rigid or too flexible, leading to a different balance between expectation and surprise. Even hallucinations in this model aren't meaningless noise. They're the brain predicting too aggressively, filling in gaps with confident guesses that aren't actually there. The same mechanism underlies delusion. When the brain clings to a prediction despite mounting evidence, it locks into a model, and reality becomes bent around it. But here sits the deeper twist. Your sense of self may also be a prediction. You expect yourself to exist, to continue, to have a stable personality, consistent preferences, a name, a body, and so your brain delivers that experience, moment to moment, as a kind of simulation. But when those predictions are disrupted, through trauma, meditation, psychedelics or neurological conditions, the sense of self can unravel. You suddenly feel foreign to yourself, detached, fluid, or even absent. In predictive processing terms, the brain loses its grip on the self model, and consciousness becomes something rawer, less filtered. Some describe this as terrifying, others as profoundly freeing, because once you see that your world and your identity are predictions, you no longer have to believe everything you think. You can begin to notice the guesses. You can witness the update. Tonight as you listen, you're predicting what I'll say next. You start predicting what this voice means. Even now, your brain is sculpting a world from sound, not receiving but creating. And when you lie in bed in the dark, your brain will continue to predict. The creak of the walls, the weight of the blanket, the idea of tomorrow. But perhaps, just for a moment, you can loosen the grip of prediction. You can allow for the rawness of now. Not what you expect, but what simply is. Because the truth is, you are not just perceiving the world, you are making it. And in every moment, you have the chance to remake it. You raise your hand. You pick up a pen. You choose to keep listening. It feels like you made that happen. You intended it. You caused it. That's your sense of agency, the feeling that you are the initiator of your actions. But what if that feeling is just that? A feeling, not evidence. Cognitive neuroscience suggests that the sense of agency is not the cause of action, but a result, a post hoc interpretation your brain makes after the fact. Let's take a step back. When you move your arm, your brain sends a motor command to the muscles. At the same time, it sends a prediction to your sensory systems, a signal that says, essentially, you are about to feel your arm moving. When the predicted sensation matches the actual sensation, your brain confirms, yes, I caused that. But when the match is off, if the feedback is delayed, distorted, or absent, your brain may decide, that wasn't me. This predictive mechanism can be experimentally disrupted. In one famous study, participants used a joystick to control a cursor on a screen, but researchers secretly altered the timing or movement. When the changes were subtle, participants still believed they were in control. When they became more noticeable, subjects often reported, "That wasn't set me moving it." Even though they were the ones acting, the mismatch broke the illusion of agency. Other experiments involve transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, to activate motor regions in the brain. A subject's finger twitches involuntarily, and yet if the context is right, they might still report having chosen to move it. This suggests that agency is not tightly bound to actual control, but to the expectation of control. The illusion of agency becomes even more complicated in certain psychological conditions. People with schizophrenia, for instance, may experience what's known as delusions of control, believing that their thoughts or actions are being controlled by external forces. Their sense of agency is disrupted. The match between intention and sensation no longer holds. Conversely, individuals with functional movement disorders may report involuntary actions, tremors, spasms, that have no clear neurological cause. Their bodies move, but they feel detached from the movement. In both cases, the system that tracks who's doing what is malfunctioning. But what if this system is always a little off? What if all of us are experiencing a cleaned-up story of what we've done, filtered through predictive models and emotional context? This idea echoes older philosophical concepts, like David Hume's claim that we never actually observe causation, only correlation. We see A followed by B and assume A caused B. The same may be true of the self. We see our body act. We feel a thought arise, and we assume we caused it. But maybe we didn't set. Maybe the action was initiated subconsciously, and the conscious mind simply took credit. This aligns with the Libet experiments we explored earlier, showing that brain activity often begins before conscious intention appears. So what does this mean for everyday life? Are you just a passenger, watching choices unfold? Is agency just a comforting illusion? Perhaps. But perhaps illusion isn't set the right word. Maybe agency is better thought of as a collaboration between unconscious systems and conscious narrative, between prediction and correction. You are not a puppeteer, nor are you a puppet. You are the coordination of many processes, some known, most hidden, weaving together the feeling of choice. And this feeling matters. It's deeply linked to mental health, moral responsibility, and personal growth. When you lose agency, you lose hope. But when you regain it, even in small, subtle ways, you begin to rewrite the narrative of your life. So maybe agency isn't about control in the traditional sense. Maybe it's about alignment. The more your actions match your deeper values, the stronger your sense of agency becomes. The more you feel congruent, inside and out. Tonight, as you lie still, watch your thoughts and actions unfold. A breath, a shift in position, a memory rising. Did you cause it? Or did it just happen? And if you can be sure, can you still find peace in participating? Because maybe agency isn't about making everything happen. Maybe it's about being present as it happens. You are not the cause of every wave, but you are here, riding the current, feeling the motion, naming the wind. And maybe that's enough. Picture your mind as a vast dark theater. In the center, a single spotlight shines down on a narrow stage. Only one actor can stand there at a time, a thought, an image, a sensation. Behind the stage, countless mechanisms churn in shadow, stagehands, whispering voices, distant memories, competing ideas, all waiting to be called forward. This is the essence of global workspace theory, GWT, one of the leading scientific models for how consciousness emerges from brain activity. Originally proposed by cognitive scientist Bernard Bars in the 1980s, and later refined through neuroscience by Stanislas Dehaene and others, GWT suggests that the brain consists of many unconscious specialized systems: vision, hearing, language, motor control, emotional regulation, all processing information in parallel. But only one of them can enter consciousness at a time. That sets the spotlight. That sets the global workspace. When a piece of information enters this workspace, through attention or surprise, it becomes globally available to the rest of the brain. Other systems can access it, update it, react to it. In this model, consciousness isn't a location in the brain. It's a broadcast, a temporary coalition of neural activity that wins the competition and becomes available to the whole system. Think of it like this. You have dozens of apps running in the background, but only one is on the screen. That's what you steer conscious of. This framework explains a lot. It explains why you can drive home while lost in thought, because the necessary systems are functioning unconsciously. It explains why a sudden noise snaps your attention, because that input forced its way onto the stage. It explains why you can hold only a few things in mind at once, because the stage is small. But GWT goes even deeper. It suggests that consciousness is not necessary for most mental processes. You can see, hear, react, even decide without conscious awareness. Only a small fraction of what your brain does ever becomes part of your inner world. This matches what brain imaging shows. In experiments where people are shown words or images too briefly to consciously register, the visual cortex still responds. But unless the signal is strong enough, or unless attention is focused, it never reaches the workspace. It never becomes experience. So why have consciousness at all? Because researchers argue the global workspace allows for flexibility. It lets different systems coordinate. It enables problem solving, future planning, moral reasoning, and self-reflection. It sets not efficient. It sets adaptive. Imagine trying to navigate a city without a map. Each part of the brain is like a local driver, good at their own route, but blind to the whole picture. The workspace is the shared map, giving access to broader context. But here's where things get mysterious. If consciousness is just a broadcast, then who is listening? Who is the audience in this mental theater? Global workspace theory sidesteps this by saying, there is no central observer. There is only the process, the spotlight, the broadcast, the ripple through the system. The self in this view is just the narrative generated by the workspace. A stream of momentary content, stitched into continuity by memory and attention. But that leads to another haunting question. If the self is just what appears on the stage, then what happens when the stage goes dark? When you sleep? When you stir under anesthesia? When the broadcast stops? Is the self paused? Or does it vanish? And what about the backstage? What if the real you, or the deeper you, is in the shadows? Not the actor on stage, but the sum total of all the systems watching from the dark. Tonight, as your thoughts rise and fall, notice the spotlight. Notice how only one idea gets to be center stage. Notice how it changes, without your control, but with your attention. You are not the actor. You are the stage, the play, the shifting lights, and maybe, just maybe, you are also the empty theater, quiet between scenes, waiting to be filled again. You often speak of yourself as a single entity. I want this. I believe that. I feel this way. But modern neuroscience and evolutionary psychology suggest something far more complicated and far less unified. What if you share not one mind, but many modules competing for control? This is the foundation of the modular mind theory, the idea that the brain is not a single decision maker, but a collection of specialized semi-independent systems, each evolved to handle specific tasks. Think of them as agents or subpersonalities, each with its own agenda. One handles hunger. Another tracks social status. One wants to stay in bed. Another wants to get in shape. One is angry. Another is ashamed of the anger. They don't bust always agree. You've felt it. The internal conflict. The emotional tug-of-war. The sensation of being of two minds. And that sip's not a metaphor. That's a real competition happening inside your brain. Psychologist Robert Kurzban, in his book Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite, explores how these mental modules often contradict one another. You might express one belief in public, and a different one in private. Not because you're lying, but because different parts of you are in charge in different contexts. This explains why people say things like, I don't BFs know why I did that. It wasn't set like me. I felt like I was watching myself. Because in a sense, you were. The module that made the choice is not the module narrating the story afterward. You are a chorus, and the soloist changes. This also explains why change is so hard. When you try to form a new habit, you may imagine a single self battling against inertia. But in truth, you are watching one module attempt to override another, each with its own history, its own logic, its own fears. And here's the paradox. All of this feels coherent. You feel like a singular self. Because one module, usually the narrative self, is particularly good at telling a story that ties it all together. It sits the spin doctor, the translator, the internal press secretary who explains conflicting behavior as if it were unified all along. But dig beneath the surface and you'll find something much stranger. You don't have to have one will. You have a parliament of instincts. Sometimes they align. Often they don't said. Consider the classic case of akrasia, acting against your own better judgment. You know you should study. You watch yourself procrastinate. You feel frustrated, as if your own mind is turned against you. It has. The module that wants short-term pleasure has overridden the one that holds long-term goals, and the narrative self scrambles to explain it. Even emotions arise modularly. The anger module activates, but the fear module may suppress it. The guilt module may fire afterward. None of them are the real you. They stir all components. And that leads to a deeper, more compassionate view of the self. If the mind is modular, then inner conflict is not failure. It's EPS architecture. And growth doesn't mean conquering the bad modules. It means learning how they interact, which ones dominate, and how to design conditions where your better selves emerge more often. This also invites a different kind of mindfulness. Instead of trying to be your true self, you observe which module is speaking, which emotion is steering, which habit is looping. You stop asking, why am I like this? And start asking which part of me is active right now. Tonight, as your thoughts slow, you might notice the voices inside. One planning tomorrow. One worrying about nothing. One remembering a mistake. One wishing you could fall asleep. They are not you, but they are yours. You are the space they arise in, the audience, the conductor, sometimes the battleground. And slowly, with awareness and care, you begin to notice which voices serve you, which ones protect, which ones sabotage, and which ones are finally ready to rest. You are not broken. You are many. And in that, you are endlessly whole. Science wants to measure. Consciousness wants to be felt. That tension sits at the heart of every theory of mind. How do you study the subjective with objective tools? You can scan the brain. You can measure attention, reaction time, electrical activity. But how do you capture the feeling of being, the flow of thoughts, the texture of emotion, the silent unfolding of awareness itself? Enter Neurophenomenology, a hybrid approach that aims to bring first-person experience into serious scientific study. Coined by neuroscientist and philosopher Francisco Varela in the 1990s, neurophenomenology attempts to bridge the gap between neuroscience, the study of the brain, and phenomenology, the study of lived experience. The core idea is simple, yet radical. You cannot fully understand consciousness from the outside. To study it, you must also investigate it from within. In other words, data from brain scans isn't enough. You need data from trained introspection, reports from individuals who can clearly articulate what they're experiencing while it happens. This isn't just vague self-reporting. It's structured, disciplined, often meditative observation of the flow of consciousness. Varela believed that long-term meditators could serve as ideal participants, not because they're mystical, but because they have trained minds capable of noticing micro-shifts in awareness that most people overlook. This approach changes the nature of the experiment. Instead of asking what happens in the brain when someone sees a red apple, neurophenomenology asks, what is the experience of said red sep like, in real time, and how does that correlate with brain activity? The subject is no longer just a lab rat. They are a co-investigator of consciousness itself. This leads to a powerful convergence. On one side, EEG readings, fMRI scans, cortical maps. On the other, reports of attentional shifts, mental imagery, emotional tone, and internal dialogue. Together these form a dual lens, Objective and subjective. External and internal. Some early studies have yielded remarkable results. In one project, Richard Davidson and colleagues studied Tibetan monks with tens of thousands of hours of meditation. Their brain scans showed unprecedented levels of gamma-wave synchrony, associated with attention, compassion, and integrative awareness. At the same time, the monks reported states of non-dual awareness, where the boundaries between self and perception dissolved. These reports weren't treated as fluff. They were correlated with measurable neural activity. In another study, participants were asked to observe the moment a thought arose, not what the thought was, but the sensation of emergence itself. Over time, some could describe the pre-thought state, a kind of felt tension or pressure before cognition. These descriptions were then matched with shifts in neural networks, particularly in the default mode network and salience network. Neurophenomenology doesn't claim to explain everything. It doesn't try to solve the hard problem of why experience exists. But it offers a way to map experience, to give language to the textures of being, and to see how those textures relate to physical systems. This matters because so much of our inner life is dismissed in science. Your grief, your wonder, your sense of timelessness, or the feeling of falling inward during sleep. These are real phenomena, and neurophenomenology argues they deserve to be studied with the same rigor as heart rates and hormones. It also offers hope for mental health. Rather than treating anxiety or depression as chemical glitches alone, neurophenomenology explores how these states are experienced, what patterns of thought and embodiment sustain them, and how conscious attention might help reshape them. It turns the study of the mind into a collaboration between first-person wisdom and third-person measurement. And it points to a profound truth, that consciousness is not a thing to be dissected, but a practice, something you can enter, describe, and even change. Tonight, as your attention drifts inward, notice your own awareness. Not the thoughts, but the field they arise in. Not the breath, but the noticing of breath. Try, even briefly, to observe what it's like to observe. That is neurophenomenology. That is science turning inward. And in doing so, it finds something no scan can show. The living, breathing, flickering miracle of you, being aware of being. You've probably been taught that consciousness arises in the brain, a late-stage development of evolution, unique to humans or perhaps higher animals. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if consciousness didn't emerge from matter, but was already inside it? This is the strange and ancient idea known as Panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, like mass, charge, or spin. According to Panpsychism, everything from electrons to galaxies possesses some intrinsic awareness, not necessarily thoughts, not minds, as we know them, but raw experiential being. A grain of sand is not thinking, but it might still have a glimmer of sentience, a kind of proto-feeling, an inwardness. This isn't set new. Variations of Panpsychism appear in Hinduism, Buddhism, indigenous cosmologies, and the writings of Plato, Spinoza, and Leibniz. But recently, it's re-emerged in serious academic circles, not as mysticism but as a potential solution to the hard problem of consciousness. That problem, as we've explored, is this: how does matter give rise to mind? Despite all we know about the brain, the circuits, the chemistry, the processing, we still cannot explain why it feels like something to be you. And some philosophers, like Galileo scholar Philip Goff, argue that maybe we can't explain it, because we're starting from the wrong assumption. Maybe consciousness doesn't need to be built up from complexity. Maybe it's already baked into the basic ingredients of reality. In this view, complex consciousness like yours arises not because neurons are special, but because systems of simple conscious particles organize in specific ways, like atoms forming molecules and molecules forming thought. It sets a kind of combination problem. Tiny sparks of consciousness come together, and out of that a self emerges. Still, this raises difficult questions. How do these micro-consciousnesses combine? Does a table have a mind? Is your iPhone alive? Critics argue that panpsychism risks explaining everything and thus explains nothing. If everything is conscious, what does that really mean? But proponents reply, even if the idea is strange, it may still be the least strange option. Because all current materialist theories, ones that try to explain consciousness purely in terms of information processing or neural networks, still fail to explain subjective experience. They explain behavior, not being. Panpsychism, in contrast, makes one bold move. It says that experience is not emergent. It's fundamental. It's not a product. It's a property. This shift reframes your entire relationship with the world. If panpsychism is true, then you are not a lonely spark of awareness in a dead universe. You are one expression of something deeper, a field of being that runs through everything. The tree is not just wood. The river is not just molecules. The sun is not just plasma. They are all participating, in some humble way, in the mystery of perception. And it invites a different kind of ethics. If matter has some form of awareness, then the world is not your object. It's your neighbor. This doesn't mean you have to weep for a rock, but it may mean rethinking the boundary between alive and not. Many indigenous worldviews already live this way. Rocks, mountains, animals, rain, all treated as persons, not resources. Not because of sentimentality, but because of direct experience. An intuitive sense that consciousness is not confined to skulls, and maybe they were right. Panpsychism doesn't claim to answer all questions, but it offers a map where other maps fail. Not a theory of how mind arises, but a reminder that mind was always here. Tonight, as you drift further inward, notice how aware you are, not just of thoughts, but of the field that holds them. That awareness may feel unique, private, human. But what if it isn't set? What if awareness is not in you, but you are in it? Floating briefly, in a sea of ancient sentience. Who are you? It seems like a straightforward question. You are the thinker of thoughts, the chooser of actions, the one who watches it all unfold. But according to leading neuroscientists like Anil Seth, this sense of self, the you feel so intimately, may not be what you think. It may be a controlled hallucination. That phrase might sound provocative, but it's grounded in deep neuroscience. To understand it, let's start with perception. We don't passively receive the world. We predict it. As we explored earlier, your brain is constantly generating models of reality, educated guesses about what's out there, and updating them when the incoming sensory data disagrees. That includes vision, hearing, touch, even time. But here's the twist. Your brain uses the same method to construct the self. According to Seth's theory, just as your brain builds a model of the world, it also builds a model of you, your body, your thoughts, your location, your boundaries. And this model is so convincing, so immersive, that you mistake it for something solid. But is not. It's a simulation, an ongoing moment-to-moment hallucination that you're in control, that you're separate, that you're singular. It's not delusion. It is useful. In fact, it's essential for survival. Your brain must maintain a model of where your body is, what it needs, how it's doing, or you wouldn't last long. But that model isn't set reality. It sets a best guess. This becomes clear in strange edge cases. Patients with out-of-body experiences often report seeing themselves from above, sometimes during trauma, near-death, or in experiments with sensory manipulation. Their brains lose track of where I is located. Or consider the rubber hand illusion, where subjects see a fake hand being stroked in sync with their hidden real hand, and quickly begin to feel that the rubber hand is part of them. These studies show how easily the self-model can be hacked. It also explains phantom limbs, when amputees feel sensation in limbs that no longer exist, because the brain's model hasn't caught up with the body. So what is the self? It's not a soul, not a substance, not a homunculus hiding behind your eyes. It's a story, an embodied narrative generated by the brain, moment by moment, based on sensory data, memories, social feedback, and expectations. A hallucination, not in the sense of falsehood, but in the sense of construction. This brings a strange peace. Because if the self is a model, then identity isn't set fixed. It can change. It can soften. It can dissolve and return. And we see this too in moments of meditation, flow, or psychedelic experience. The self disappears, not in horror but in relief, like a burden being lifted. Because behind the model, there is still awareness, still presence, still something that notices. And Seth writes, being you is not about what you are, but about what you experience yourself to be. And that experience is flexible. The Buddhist tradition has said this for millennia. There is no self, only skandhas, aggregates of body, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, held together like a fist, made only of fingers. No core. Just process. Modern neuroscience seems to agree, but this doesn't mean nothing matters. On the contrary, it means everything does. Because if the self is a construction, then every choice, every habit, every act of attention, is part of the building process. You are not discovering yourself. You are generating yourself, and you can do it differently. Tonight, as your mind softens, you might notice the contours of you beginning to blur. The edge between body and air, between thought and observer, between this is me and this is happening. Don't fight it. It sets not loss. It accepts freedom. The self is a hallucination, but not an error. A useful dream, a gentle fiction your brain tells, so that you can move through a mysterious world and call it yours. And when the dream softens, what remains is not nothing. What remains is being. What makes something conscious? Not just reactive, not just intelligent, but aware, rich with experience. Is it the number of neurons? The complexity of thought? The ability to suffer? One of the boldest and most mathematically rigorous answers comes from Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, a model proposed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. At its heart is a radical idea. Consciousness is not what a system does. It's what a system is, when information is deeply and irreducibly integrated. Let's unpack this. According to IIT, for any system to be conscious, two things must be true. It must contain information. It must have many possible states and a specific one right now. That information must be integrated. The parts must interact in such a way that the system as a whole is more than the sum of its parts. This leads to a measurable quantity, phi, a mathematical expression of how integrated a system is. The higher the phi, the more conscious the system. For example, a simple camera records visual input. It processes information, but each pixel acts independently. There's no integration. There is near zero, no consciousness. By contrast, your brain, even while asleep, is a vast web of interlocking activity. Every part influences and is influenced by others. That deep integration gives rise to a unified field of experience. Not scattered lights but a pattern. And here is the fascinating part. I claims that consciousness is that pattern. The shape of the integrated information is the experience itself. Not correlated with it. Not generated by it. Identical to it. This is called ontological identity, the claim that the structure of consciousness is the shape of information inside the system. In other words, your experience of blue or sadness or being here now is not floating in the air above your brain. It is the shape your brain takes when those states occur. Change the pattern, change the experience, destroy the integration, and the experience fades. This view has startling implications. It suggests that any system, biological or artificial, could in theory be conscious if its internal information is highly integrated. Not just computers that process data, but only those whose architecture produces a unified field. And this leads to a new test for consciousness, not based on behavior, language or emotion, but based on measurable phi. Some researchers have used IIT to probe vegetative states, trying to determine if patients who can't respond might still be conscious. By applying auditory stimuli and analyzing EEG patterns, they measure the integration, and in some cases find that it's higher than expected. A patient may not move, may not speak, but they may still be there, silently aware. Of course, it is controversial. Critics argue that it's too abstract, too untestable, too quick to assign consciousness to systems that seem unconscious, like electrical circuits or networks. But its defenders say, Maybe the weirdness is the point. We assumed for centuries that matter was dead and mind was rare. But what if consciousness is more common, more subtle, and structured, not by what something does, but by how deeply its parts connect? Imagine two orchestras. Both play the same notes. But one plays them with timing, emotion, resonance, a full integration of parts. That seps the difference between noise and music, between function and feeling. Tonight, as your thoughts begin to scatter or fade, you might feel your own integration shift. Ideas that once felt linked may drift. Memories may lose their sharp edges. The field narrows. Consciousness dims. But even in its dimmest state, it still has form. You are not just aware. You are awareness structured. A brief, fragile pattern. In a vast web of information. Holding itself together. For just a moment longer. You've likely heard the phrase, unconscious mind, and imagined a dark basement of repressed desires, hidden memories, and psychological ghosts. But modern neuroscience paints a far more dynamic, and far stranger picture. The unconscious is not a passive container. It's an active intelligence, fast, flexible, and often more accurate than your conscious thought. In fact, most of what your mind does, you never notice. This leads us to one of the most paradoxical theories of consciousness, that the unconscious is not beneath consciousness. It might be running the show. Start with decision-making. In one famous study, participants were shown pairs of abstract paintings and asked to choose their favorite. But before they answered, researchers briefly flashed an emotional face, too fast to consciously register. The subject's preferences shifted based on these subliminal primes. They felt like they made a choice freely, but unconscious emotion tilted the decision. In another study, people were asked to shop for a car based on various features. When given time to think rationally, their choices were often inconsistent. But when distracted, when their unconscious had time to process, their decisions improved. Your unconscious isn't set just reacting. It's weighing options, detecting patterns, making predictions, faster and more efficiently than your conscious mind ever could. And it doesn't stop there. You can perceive things unconsciously. In patients with blind sight, a part of the visual cortex is damaged, leaving them blind in one part of their field. But when asked to guess whether a shape or light was present in the blind zone, they consistently guessed correctly. They couldn't see it, but something inside them knew. Even facial expressions are often read unconsciously. You might sense someone's anger before they say a word. Not by magic, but by micro-expressions, muscle shifts too subtle for conscious detection, yet processed unconsciously by your brain. So what is the unconscious really? Not a separate place. Not a Freudian cellar. It sets the majority of your mind. The silent processor behind attention, perception, memory, language, emotion, and even creativity. Psychologist John Bargh called it the autopilot. You think you stir flying the plane, but most of the time, you're just monitoring instruments. This challenges our assumptions about free will, responsibility, and even selfhood. If your unconscious is making choices before you steer aware, are they really your choices? If a hunch saves you, was it intuition? Or just well-trained unconscious pattern recognition? And what happens when unconscious systems clash? You want to eat healthy. You crave the sugar anyway. Who steps in charge? Maybe no one. Maybe the self is the story your conscious mind tells. To explain the tug-of-war between deeper systems, this doesn't make you powerless. It makes you plural. But here sits the hopeful side. The unconscious can be trained. Through repetition, environment, emotion, you shape it. Habits become automatic. Fears can be rewired. Compassion can be primed. You are always programming your deeper mind, whether you realize it or not. This also reframes the purpose of mindfulness. It's not about stopping thought. It's about noticing what your unconscious is doing, so you can influence it gently, over time. Tonight, as you let your body relax and your mind drift, you may feel consciousness start to blur. A soft descent into dreams, sensations, vague ideas. You so lose track of the voice. You so stop holding on to thoughts. And yet, your unconscious will keep listening. Keep weaving meaning. Keep learning. Because the mind never stops. You are not just the light of awareness, you are the engine behind it, silent, vast, thinking when you think you have stopped. And sometimes, the part of you that isn't set you, knows you better than you do. Every night you fall into darkness. Your muscles soften. Your awareness thins. The world slips away. And then, without warning, another world begins. A room that doesn't set exist. A voice that isn't set real. A problem you never knew you had, solved in a place that vanishes by morning. This is dream consciousness, one of the most mysterious states the brain can enter, and perhaps one of the most revealing. Because in dreams your mind constructs entire realities without effort. It generates space, time, character, conflict, resolution, all while the conscious self sleeps. The deeper question is, who is doing the dreaming? You're not in control. You're often not even aware that you're dreaming, and yet the world unfolds around you, vivid, emotional, sometimes terrifying, sometimes sublime. How? Neuroscience has shown that dreams occur primarily during REM sleep, rapid eye movement, when brain activity resembles the waking state, active, electrical, chaotic. Regions like the visual cortex, limbic system and associative areas light up. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and self-monitoring, goes mostly offline. In other words, the parts of your brain that build reality are firing, but the parts that question reality are quiet. That's why dreams feel real, until they don't set. What's astonishing is how coherent they can be. You can hold conversations, experience emotion, even solve problems. In one study, participants were given puzzles or creative tasks. After a night of sleep, many awoke with new insights, sometimes delivered within a dream. The unconscious had been processing in the background, connecting dots the waking mind couldn't see. Artists, scientists, and writers have long drawn inspiration from dreams. Paul McCartney claimed the melody for Yesterday came to him in a dream. The periodic table reportedly came to Mendeleev while sleeping. Frankenstein was born in a dream experienced by Mary Shelley. These aren't set myths. They're evidence that dream consciousness is a creative force, but it also raises unsettling questions. Why can dreams be so emotional? Because the amygdala, the brain's emotion center, is hyperactive during REM. You may not remember the story, but you remember the fear, the longing, the grief. And why do dreams often involve the self in unfamiliar form? Because identity in dreams is fluid. You can be yourself and not yourself. You can switch perspectives mid-scene. You can die and keep dreaming. This challenges our sense of a stable, waking self. In dreams, the I is a construct, just like everything else. Even stranger is the phenomenon of lucid dreaming, when the dreamer becomes aware that they're dreaming. Studies using eye movement signals have confirmed this is real. During lucid dreams, parts of the prefrontal cortex reactivate, allowing self-reflection within the dream. In this state, the dreamer can often control the dream, fly, create objects, revisit memories. And yet, even in lucid dreams, there is mystery. You might talk to dream characters who express thoughts you didn't expect. You might discover landscapes you feel you've known forever. Which raises the question, if you created this, why doesn't it feel like yours? Some philosophers argue that dreams reveal a deeper layer of consciousness, not just memory or fantasy but pure construction. They show that reality as you experience it is always a simulation, waking or sleeping. Because if your brain can build a world while you sleep, how much of your waking life is also constructed? Dreams dissolve the illusion of solidity. They show that experience is made, not found. That identity is fluid, not fixed. That the mind is a creator, not just a witness. Tonight, as sleep begins to rise behind your eyes, you may find yourself slipping again, into rooms that don't exist, with people who never were, in stories that never happened. And yet, you will walk them, feel them, believe them, and perhaps, if you notice, you will realize that you are the dream, the dreamer, and the dreaming itself. Imagine a moment with no thoughts, no memories, no words, no images, no identity, no world. Just awareness. Is such a state even possible? Many spiritual traditions say yes. And now, some cognitive scientists are starting to agree. This is the idea of consciousness without content, the experience of pure awareness, stripped of all objects. No thing to notice, just the noticing itself. It sounds paradoxical. How can you be conscious of nothing? Isn't consciousness always about something? A sound, a feeling, a thought. That's what most of Western philosophy assumed for centuries. Consciousness is always intentional. It always has an object. But contemplative practices, particularly in Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and certain mystical branches of Christianity and Islam, describe a different state. A silent, spacious, still awareness that remains when all content dissolves. Meditators call it open awareness, non-dual awareness, or simply presence. In this state, you are not focused on anything. You are not thinking. You are not perceiving a thing. But awareness is still there, quiet, effortless, lucid. And you know it. Not as a thought, but as being. Neuroscience is beginning to investigate this. Advanced meditators have been scanned during states of so-called contentless consciousness. In some cases, their EEG readings show reduced activity in sensory areas, but sustained activation in attention and awareness networks. Something remains awake, even when the usual inputs are silent. This aligns with reports from deep meditative absorption states, jhanas, certain psychedelic experiences, and even near-death experiences, where the subject feels no body, no time, no thought, but pure presence. It sets not peace. It sets not joy. It sets not emptiness. It seeds prior to all that. It's the ground of experience, not what you experience but the capacity to experience. Some describe it as a mirror, present for every reflection but never touched by them. Others call it awareness aware of itself, not as a loop but as a quiet self-sustaining glow. This raises a radical possibility. Maybe consciousness is not something the brain creates, but something the brain filters. As physicist Erwin Schrödinger once speculated, the overall number of minds is just one. Perhaps what we call self is just the narrowing of awareness through form. And when that form relaxes, the field opens. That might explain why this state is so hard to describe. Because the self can't narrate it, the self is silent in it. The Zen tradition has a phrase, no mind, no mirror, only the moonlight falling on the water. But don't mistake this for blankness. It sets not nothingness. It's not unconsciousness. It sets a vibrant present nothing. A nothing that knows it sets there. Why does this matter? Because so much of our suffering comes from content. Thoughts we can set control. Emotions we over-identify with. Stories that replay endlessly. But if there is awareness beneath all that, and if you can touch it even briefly, then you are never trapped. You don't need to stop the storm. You just need to remember the sky. Tonight, as your mind grows quieter, and the content begins to dissolve, try not to chase new thoughts. Just rest. Not on the breath. Not on the body. Not even on this voice. Rest in the noticing. Rest in the space between. And if for a moment everything fades, and yet something remains, gentle, open, ungraspable, then maybe you met it. The consciousness that doesn't need content. The silence that still knows. The you beneath the you. For most of history, consciousness was seen as a byproduct. A side effect of brains. A flicker of awareness inside evolved animals. On a lonely rock in a mindless universe. But a growing chorus of scientists and philosophers now ask a far stranger question. What if consciousness isn't set inside the universe, but the universe is inside consciousness? This is the core idea behind the participatory universe, first proposed by physicist John Archibald Wheeler, and echoed by interpretations of quantum mechanics, idealist philosophy, and certain ancient traditions. It sets a theory that whispers, reality may not exist independently of observation. It may require a witness to become real. In the quantum world, this is more than poetry. Consider the famous double-slit experiment. When particles like electrons are fired through two slits toward a screen, they create an interference pattern, behaving like waves. But when a detector is placed to observe which slit they go through, the interference pattern collapses. The particles behave like particles. They change their behavior depending on whether they're being observed. Even stranger, it doesn't matter whether the observation happens now or later, only that somewhere in the process the outcome is known. This led physicist Eugene Wingert to speculate that consciousness is necessary for the universe to take form. That wave functions don't set collapse into specific realities, until there is mind to receive them. Wheeler called this the observer participancy principle. The idea that the cosmos is not a static machine, but a kind of self-creating feedback loop between what exists and what perceives. No phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. Wheeler. And if that sip's true, then the presence of awareness isn't set accidental. It's essential. It's just not that consciousness emerged from dust. It's that dust never existed without consciousness. This flips everything. It means that your awareness is not a meaningless side effect of chemical reactions in a private brain. It may be the very thing that makes anything exist at all. It also reframes identity. If consciousness is fundamental, then your experience is not isolated. It is a window into something shared. You are not a consciousness. You are consciousness, playing a temporary character. This aligns with non-dual traditions in Hinduism and Buddhism, which say that the self is an illusion, and all things arise in awareness like waves on an ocean. You stir not the wave. You stir the water, or in the words of Alan Watts, you are the universe looking at itself from billions of points of view. But is this testable? Not yet. The link between quantum mechanics and consciousness remains speculative, a philosophical frontier, not a proven fact. Still, the theory is gaining traction, not because it sits proven, but because everything else keeps failing. To explain why the universe is not just cold and indifferent, but felt, why there is not just form, but meaning, not just complexity, but experience. If consciousness is required for the world to exist, then reality is not just atoms in space. It's its relation. It's reflection. It's its knowing. Tonight, as your mind sinks into silence, and this journey draws to a close, know this. The universe is not distant. It is here, in you as you, with you. Not because you are special, but because you are aware, and awareness may be the most real thing of all. Sev traveled a long way. Through neural circuits and quantum riddles, through illusions of choice, and dreams that build themselves. Through silent awareness, predictive ghosts, and selves that dissolve when no one sits watching. What began as a question, what is consciousness, has returned as something softer. Not an answer, but a presence. You've seen that your thoughts are not always yours, that your memories may be rewritten, that your reality is stitched from predictions. And yet, you are here, listening, feeling, wondering, and that may be the point. Maybe consciousness isn't set a puzzle to be solved, but a mirror to be recognized. Not a machine to dissect, but a field to walk through slowly, knowing it sets alive, even when it says nothing. You've glimpsed the brain steps backstage, seen the lights flicker, the stage shift, the actor become the audience, and somewhere in the quiet, you may have noticed, you were never just a thinker. You were the space between thoughts. You were the silence that listens after the voice fades. All these theories, global workspaces, integrated information, predictive loops, they are maps. Useful, fascinating, flawed. But what they point to is you. Not the name, not the role, but the noticing, the stillness behind the motion, the eye that sees but is never seen. You are not an object in the world. You are the openness the world appears in. And even if no one ever finds the final answer, even if no lab, no equation, no guru can name what you are still here. Still aware of being aware. So tonight, as the lights inside you dim, and the thoughts begin to untangle, let yourself return to what has no theory, not thought, not self, just this moment, this witness, This quiet flame of knowing, not to grasp it, not to solve it, just to remember. You were never looking at the mystery. You were the mystery, looking back.